Hi everyone! So today I'm going to be doing a video about classic novels, how to start reading them, what they are, suggestions I have, and just, yeah, basically that whole overview. So, I first wanted to start off this video by explaining what a classic novel is, because I think sometimes people don't necessarily know what constitutes as a classic novel. So I just Googled it, looked up Wikipedia. um, One of the things it says in the opening statement is a classic book is a book a classic is a book accepted as being exemplary or noteworthy, um, being listed in a list of great books through readers' personal opinion. The term is associated with Western canon. It could be applied to works in literature from all traditions. But one of the definitions that really stuck out to me, it's in the under modern definitions on Wikipedia if you wanted to look at it. It said in the 1980s, Italo Calvino said in his essay, Why Read the Classics, that a classic is a book that has never finished what it has to say. And that definition really resonates with me. I've tried to record this video a couple times, and in those before I looked up the definition of a classic novel, I said that I felt like a classic novel is something that is relevant and pertinent throughout the test of time. I mean, that just says it perfectly. It never is done saying what it has to say. It's never finished, because people thousands of years from now can read it and still gain some sort of perspective or understanding from it. And I think that's why a lot of these books are 50 years old, 100 years old, because they're, no matter who reads them, they're permanent. Whereas there are other books that, have been lost in time and space because they were great books at the time, but they aren't relevant to today's people. Um, so one of the things that I've found with reading classic novels is that they're increasingly difficult to understand or hard to read. My first exposure to classic novels was when I was in seventh grade, and I went into the library. I love history. I love old things, so I went in there, looked at Pride and Prejudice, and I was like, yes, this is what I was gonna read. I went home, opened the book up, and I couldn't understand what it was trying to say at all. And from that point on, I was like, nope. I don't want to read classic novels. They're too hard. They're not relevant. You can't understand them. There's no reason why somebody in the 21st century should be reading a book from that long ago. They're completely useless. So when we were reading Canterbury Tales or Shakespeare, I just drowned that out in my mind because it was like so not worth it. Then near the end of high school, I started getting into historical literature. And that is how I got my introduction to classic novels, and that's why I still love classic novels, and I read them avidly now, and I have a huge collection of them. As you can see, in my closet is filled with books, and a lot of them are down because I have them right here. I have shelves around my walls, and half are books and half are stuffed animals, and I have books in storage down in the basement. I'm obsessed with books, and I have way too many, but classics are ones that I really enjoy because not only are they usually cheap, it's a great, like, hobby to have because you get so much from the books, and like the ones from Barnes and Noble, the classic novels range from like $3.95 in US dollars to like $10. Like that's a great, like, you're saving so much money instead of being like collecting Lolita like I do, or collecting like Furby, like, stuff that's has more value. But not necessarily. So anyway, let me just jump into this. This was a really long introduction. So as I said, I got into reading classic novels by reading historical fiction. So in middle school, I was reading the American Girl diaries books. I don't have any anymore, but for people, like, if you're in middle school reading this or watching this, or in elementary school or something like that, those books are really great to start off learning about, I guess, the culture and the way society was when these books were written. So here's my little stack of books like this, and I'm gonna say them in order from where I think you should start and working your way up to more difficult reads. So the first one that I have, my favorite era was the Tudor era in the not 1800s, 1400s, 1500s. So this book is called Guilt, and it's by Catherine Longshore. And this book is about Catherine, not Boleyn, but Howard. Yeah, Catherine Howard. I think that was King Henry VIII's fifth wife. And this book it's not like the greatest novel I've ever read by any means, but it's very definitely easily like a starter entry level, like sort of giving you a taste of what classic novels might be like. So it doesn't have a lot on the page. The font's really standard size, you know. I read it in a day, I think, but the thing that's good about this sort of book is it gives you a taste of what the sort of customs, I guess, you would be reading about in other books. So things that they would mention normally, for instance, like getting dressed or something like that, you know, that we're not familiar with in this day and age. You might not necessarily understand what that means, and you might be tripping up on that when you're reading classic novels if you jump straight into them. So this book gives you a sort of taste. It's totally not accurate in a lot of ways. There's some things that the characters say that are just totally silly, but this is a great example of something that you would start if you wanted to get into classic literature, but you don't feel like you're ready to take that on yet. So this is my first suggestion. My next suggestion, if you want something a little higher level than this, because this is a young adult's novel, I believe, is Philippa Gregory, and this is just an example. If you don't care about the Tudor era, if you don't care about English history, you could start with, there are several historical fiction books about, like, the turn of the century in the US. You can find literally historical fiction books about anything, and I think they're really important when getting into classic novels. I apologize ahead of time if this video is really long, because I feel like it's going to be long, because I have a lot to say, but anyway, so I have a lot of Philippa Gregory books, so these are just a couple that I could find right away. Of course, her most popular one is The Other Boleyn Girl, and I loved that book. That was the defining book that brought me into wanting to know about history and classic literature, because as I read it, I did not know that all these people actually existed until after I finished it, and my sister was like, oh, like, this character did this. I don't want to give away the ending if you don't know the history, like I didn't, but, yeah, so I was like, what are you talking about? And she's like, those were all real people. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is so cool. And it just really added a lot to the works for me. So this is The Red Queen. This is about Margaret Beaufort, who, I read this already, but I can't remember. Oh, she's the heiress to the Red Rose of Lancaster is what it says. But this book was really good because it sort of gives you a insight to the religious aspect of that era. I learned a lot from this book. I mean, of course, you have to take it with a grain of salt. It's not perfectly accurate. However, it does give you sort of a taste of the cultural differences you might be seeing in these books versus reading something about, like, the modern era where they have cell phones and you could just communicate instantly, and, you know, morals that were held, and, you know, the role of men and women. This gives you an idea of the religious aspect. And then The Constant Princess by Philippa Gregory. This is about King Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and this book gives you an idea of, like, arranged marriages and how they worked. I mean, again, it's not completely historically accurate or anything, but it sort of gives you a taste of what you're going to be learning about. And then finally, The Boleyn Inheritance, and this is about Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Jane Rochfort, but it mostly, I think, focuses on Anne of Cleves, if I remember right. This is also by Philippa Gregory. I love the Tudor era, so that's why these are my suggestions. But as for other suggestions, maybe on different eras that you might be reading, Kindred is a good one, because I feel like this is kind of a historical novel. It's by Octavia Butler, and this is about a woman who sort of time travels, I guess. and she goes back into the slave era in the U.S. And it just gives it points out a lot of the differences between the modern day and back in the day, like years ago. So it shows you like the contrast that you might be encountering when you're reading classic novels. It gives you a little bit of a vocabulary. I think that's why these books are important, because they sort of build up your vocabulary of words that we don't use anymore, and I think that's important. I hate editing my videos, so sorry about the jump cut, but I just got distracted real quick. But as I was saying, this is The Signature of All Things by Elizabeth Gilbert. And sorry all of these titles are flipped. I'm on my webcam. Maybe I could edit that out, so if I did, just ignore that last statement. But anyway, this is a story about a girl named Alma Whittaker, and it takes place at the turn of the century in 1800s in the United States. And this is an excellent book if you want to know more about, like, I guess, without doing the research, knowing about the historical side of science and knowing about the turn of the century in the U.S. And I just really loved this book. It was super great. And yeah, I think these sort of books are all really great primers for understanding the context of a lot of things that are happening in the classic novels that you will be reading later. So, next I'm going to be talking about classics that I feel like are easy enough to read right away. If you want to, that is. But, you know, if you don't, if you feel like you need to work yourself up like I did, then by all means do that. But if you've read these books, you know, you feel like you can understand basically the lingo that's going on, I guess, then one of my favorites, and these are all sort of macabre, they're sort of like the gothic classic novels, so I apologize if my taste differs from yours. But the first one is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And this is an excellent book. It's such a great book. So it was really easy for me to read in high school. It wasn't too crazy or anything. And this is actually a form that is a Barnes & Noble classic. And the cool thing about the Barnes & Noble classics are that on the inside, well, it has a picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde, who's a really fabulous author, and I really enjoy his work, so I highly recommend him. He doesn't write too difficult to understand. You'll see what I mean later, but it has this sort of introduction about who Oscar Wilde was and what he did, and then this also says the world of Oscar Wilde. So this part is a timeline that sort of explains some of the things that were happening at the time he wrote this and when he died and when he lived, which really gives you a good idea of like his world and why he would be writing about certain things. And then the introduction part gives you a little bit of an idea of what's going to be happening in the novel. So if it's a little too difficult for you to like understand some of the customs and stuff, reading the beginning parts of the Barnes & Noble Classics really helps you, like, understanding okay, you don't need to get caught up on certain words we don't use anymore. You could just read it straight through. So, The Picture of Dorian Gray is an excellent book. It's probably one of my favorite books of all time as well. And then, Barnes & Noble Classics also came out with the Collected Oscar Wilde, which is all of his works. This is actually the second book I have of all of his works. I think this is all of his works. It could be some of them. But anyway, it's all of them. And he writes poetry, short stories, he writes plays, and then he has novels. I think he just has one novel, but I'm not sure. But anyway, this book, the collection books give you a lot of reading material, especially for authors like Oscar Wilde who write poetry and short stories, so you don't need to, try and read and digest this huge work, You could just read a short story and sort of get a taste for what you're going to be reading later. So that is the Collected Oscar Wilde. As it's a Barnes & Noble classic, it also has that introduction part that I find really helpful. Another one of my favorite books for if you're trying to get into classic literature is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and I don't know where my copy is. I actually have two copies, so I have no idea where they are. But I love that book. It's excellent. It's so great. If you love science, that's totally your book. If you love science and you want to get into classic literature, I suggest reading The Signature of All Things and then reading Frankenstein because they're just great. They're not too hard of a read. You might need to work up to Frankenstein, but you can definitely read it if you don't work up to it, and it's just a really good book. I suggest it totally, and it definitely makes you think about how different it is, knowing the stories of Frankenstein and then reading the actual book that it came from, and you see how movies are totally different. Another book similar in that vein is Dracula by Bram Stoker. I love this book. I'm just gonna say that about every book, but this book was excellent. So much better than every movie I've ever seen, any rendition of Dracula I've ever seen. This book is so good and so worth reading. I mean, if you can get anything from this video, I really hope that you understand the importance of classic literature, which I maybe will make a different video about. Why should you read classics? Because they give you such a new perspective on life that you've never seen. But anyway, Dracula is a story that a lot of people are familiar with and a lot of people understand. So this book is really good, but it's definitely one of those you have to work up to. Because the diction in this book is somewhat difficult to understand. There's some dialects in here in certain parts that people do not use anymore, as far as I know, or they don't use in the US, so it's a little hard to understand. There are a lot of things that were hard to follow for me, so this read was definitely like difficult to get through, but you definitely can, and you definitely should. And just as a comparison, the text in this book is extremely small, extremely dense, and it's, this book is probably twice or even 3 times as much writing as Guilt. So, this is going to be way more of a read to digest than that first one, but the first one can give you an idea of the sort of setting that you have in here. So definitely read Dracula. Definitely read Dracula. Another set of selected fiction, Kate Chopin, and she is a poet and a short story writer, and this is why I love her specifically, because you could just read something real quick. This is Awakening and other short stories that she's written, so we have a lot of her short stories. Also, Edgar Allan Poe, another one of those poets who does short stories that you could read and get a feel for what you're going to be reading. Those are like entry-level classic novels, I think, that are really excellent. But Kate Chopin is really good. She's definitely she's like a feminist writer, and I really like that. I haven't read The Awakening, but I've read a lot of her short stories, and I think they're really good. They're not so much to digest, and you could read it in a sitting and maybe like think about what it means. A Pair of Silk Stockings was one of my favorite stories. It's really interesting. It's talking about a Victorian woman who has a couple extra dollars to spend one day, so she goes out and goes shopping, gets like a corset and like some silk stockings and like gloves, I believe, and it just sort of is very different because that's something we do a lot in this day and age, go shopping for ourselves. But back in the day when women had like 8 kids to take care of and not as much money and living, well below the means that we live now, it's very interesting to see the different sorts of societies that existed in the past. So Kate Chopin is one that I highly recommend as like entry-level classics. And then finally, there's a whole world of difficult reads if you are at the top level of classic novels. A lot of the ones that I've read, I haven't finished. So, Anna Karenina, I'm reading currently. All of these I say currently, but I've been reading them for a couple years. I am in school, so I forget to do reading a lot because I have a lot of other reading on top of it. But Anna Karenina is really good so far. What is it called? Love and War by Leo Tolstoy. They're both by Leo Tolstoy, actually. Really good, really difficult reads. Another one is Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility. And then one of the ones that I have finished, is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, or Bront. I'm not sure how you say it. This book is very thick, and this book is like the classic novel. Like, you think of classic novels, you think of Pride and Prejudice and Jane Eyre. This book was really good, but is like totally different than like everything that I was used to, and it was definitely a difficult read. It took me a good couple months to read it, and I was like reading it, in all of my spare time. Some parts I had to go back and try again because it's just really high diction, lots of words we don't use, lots of cultural customs that don't make sense. So, you kind of have to look up, oh, well, I don't know why they're mentioning this. Is this something people did? But I highly suggest Jane Eyre. It's a really great book. A lot of people consider it a love story, and I could see that, but in a lot of ways, I feel like it's more just a story of someone's life. It's just taking this character and just following through all of her life. So I really suggest it, and I guess that's all I have to say about classic novels for now, which sounds totally silly considering how this is going to be like a 20-minute video. But thank you for watching. If you have any like comments or suggestions or something, just let me know down below. Thank you for watching. I hope you guys have a great day. Bye!